Well, welcome to a special episode of the Speaker Series from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm David Himmelgreen, Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for the Advancement of Food Security and Healthy Communities at USF. And it is my pleasure today to speak with a good friend and colleague and someone who's deeply involved with addressing food security and hunger issues in Tampa Bay, Thomas Mantz, who's the President and CEO of Feeding Tampa Bay. And I just want to start by saying Feeding Tampa Bay and USF have had a long-term relationship now, a partnership, and I think we are one of the few in the country partnerships between a university and a food bank. And so it really is a special type of relationship we have, and just really great to have Thomas here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me in. I'm excited about having this conversation with you. We've been friends and colleagues for a long time in this work, and so I appreciate the chance to chat more. Thank you.
Thanks. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about Feeding Tampa Bay, its mission, its goals,
Sure.
who you serve, the kinds of services you provide, and some of the exciting things that are happening.
Yeah. So maybe we'll start at the beginning, because I think sometimes when folks listen to something or watch something like this, they don't always know the background and origin of food banks and food relief, the food relief missions. We are one of 200 food banks across the United States, and we're part of the Feeding America Network, and so it's a national reach. And food banks were all created in communities largely in the 70s as the challenges of our community grew, right? Economic challenges. For people your and my age, we started to see gaps between those that had resources, those that didn't. We went through several recessions. Food banks really formed in that time where we had to find a way to support individuals and families who were struggling. And the concept was simple. There is excess food in every community. And prior to food banking being invented, to use the term, that food went into landfills. And food banks were created to say, we have two distinct needs here. There's excess food that someone wants to get to someone, and there are people that need it, and food banks were created to step in the middle of that gap. And I think one of the things charity does when it does it well is it steps into gaps. And the question folks always ask right after that is, well, where does the food come from and how does this work? Right? So Feeding Tampa Bay, an organization like ours, when we talk about food, there is all kinds of excess food in the system. So if you're a farmer and you grow produce, you have what's called culls, but really the word for that, or what that word means, is it's not attractive for retail. So it's perfectly consumable, but you might not buy it. It's cucumber that's not the right color, or apple that's a bit too hard. Those generally were discarded. Well, now an organization like ours gets that food. At the retail store, we always tell the story of asking all your viewers, when you go to the milk section of your local grocery store, what do you do? Everybody does the same thing. They stick their hand in and they push all today's date to the side and they reach in the back. All of that's perfectly good food that our community can use. And so we work at trying to get that into the homes of folks that are otherwise would not have access to good, nutritious food. So that's kind of the founding origin of what we do, and why we were built was to step into that gap. It's a far more sophisticated model today than it ever has been, but that was the original intent, was to make sure that folks in our community who didn't have the proper meals on their tables had access to that.
So talk a little bit about what Feeding Tampa Bay is doing now. Yeah. I know you have a new strategic plan, a new facility that's going up, really exciting stuff.
So as so food banks, Feeding Tampa Bay has been here for 42 years. So as the model evolved, it's, as I said a moment ago, it's become much more sophisticated. So when you think about an organization like ours, we cover a 10-county area, service area. That's about 9,000 square miles. A lot of folks in that, about 5.5 million. And statistically, David, about 1 million plus are considered food insecure. And I think when we define food insecurity, you can tell us the USDA definition, but what we know about food insecurity is I don't have steady access to nutritious food. And so that's the layperson's definition. The USDA definition would be different, but that's really what's happening. And so we have about 1 million folks every day that may be seeking our assistance for food. So in order to do that, we've had to build a fairly complex and large model to move 125 million pounds of food every year. We're one of the largest food banks in the United States. We're one of the largest charities in Tampa, and statistically, we're one of the largest charities in the United States. We're 98 in the top 100 size charities in the United States. So in terms of size and significance, it's substantial. So we've grown in sophistication in terms of how we get food into the communities. What started as a faith-based exercise of moving food to churches has evolved into school pantries, medical facility pantries, all kinds of sophisticated opportunities to, again, make sure that we're looking after our guests thoughtfully. As you know, we now operate 3 restaurants. So in addition to groceries, we do meals. And so we built that part of our business out. Along the way, David, I think what you have helped us understand, the work that we've done with USF and the broader community has helped us understand that food's not the underlying problem, it's symptomatic of a household that is in economic distress. But more people will come in for food than anything else, because if you think about it, you can probably avoid your landlord a little bit. You can carpool to cut down on gas costs. You can pay some of your bills late, but goodness, you have to eat. And so as we started to look at that and understand that families were making really, really difficult choices, food was often an area people were compromising on and or going without. And so as they came to see us, we started to ask ourselves the question, what can we do more and what can we do differently? How can we start to expand our roster of services so that when someone came to us at that point of contact, we could either provide that service or refer that service out. A better way for someone watching this to think about it is your favorite store, retailer, company, they do a very good job of, let's think Apple, right? Lots of folks have Apple products. When you walk into the Apple store, you can get an Apple Watch, you can get an Apple phone, you can get an Apple computer, but you can also get an Apple phone holder, you can get charging devices. They've done a really good job of saying to you as a consumer, everything you need to have this possession is here. So that's one-stop shopping for you. For the folks that we serve, and I think you could expand on this much more, the cost of being poor is very expensive. Right? It's funny to say that, but it's true. And so the more that we're able to, at the point of contact, the moment of connection, provide additional services and resources, we achieve 2 things. First, principally, we provide that particular individual the services they may need. But secondarily, it also becomes a conversation about prevention rather than intervention. And I think for us, the great challenge in all of our work is that intervention is expensive and generally too late. I think what we want to continue to do as we think about this is how do we move forward up towards prevention so that we're keeping families stable, families healthy, kids in school, seniors out of medical care. How do we build those kind of programs? And a lot of our future is about that expansion of services.
That's great. I know when we've talked before, it's more than just about food. And you mentioned prevention. And could you talk about some of the really innovative programs going on at Feeding Tampa Bay now that, yes, there's food, but there's more?
Yeah, so I think when we ever, again, I want to emphasize, I think it must be on my mind, but I want to emphasize that any good provider of services thinks about ways to break down barriers of access for their clients, right? And so when we provide a service, we want to break down 3 barriers. Time, because it's a valuable asset. You and I can afford our time. We can buy our time if we need to. We can pay for services, right? But we want to make sure we solve for time. We want to make sure we solve for location. Moving around a community is expensive, right? And third, we want to solve for cost. So any intervention we build, time, location, and cost are always our thinking. So we have several ways we approach that. A good example is a school pantry. We started building pantries inside schools where a family can come in when they pick up their child, go to the pantry inside the school, grab a couple of bags of groceries for free and head home because there are already schools in their neighborhood, they're already there with their child, and now there's free healthy food available to them. That's a great example of that. But we've done that in other areas. We're now expanding into medical clinics. Right, so now we know that the conversation that clinicians are having with their patients are about proper health care and nutrition. So now we're putting those same kind of food pantries in healthcare clinics. So we think about it in that way. But we also think about it in other ways. One of the greatest predictors of success for someone in the future is a job. So we have an entire job training program that can get you a Class B CDL license, so you can be a truck driver, warehouse logistics, so you can be a technician, culinary arts, heck, we even do barista training, because these are things that give someone the opportunity for self-determination, right? So we've really moved much more into the individualized services, but we've also done other things, like we have mobile grocery stores that literally go into different parts of the community. We roll up the sides, they're like beverage trucks, and someone can come in and shop for, again, free, the items that they need, or sometimes if they use their SNAP EBT card, they can get those items. And so we've tried to, wherever we can, break down barriers to access. I would say, of course, this sounds a little self-congratulatory, we are probably one of the most innovative food banks in our network. We know this because we talked to our peer group. We're the only food bank in the network that actually has a health services clinic, which Baycare built for us, inside of our food bank, which is right next to our free grocery store. So I was there last night. We had Baycare on site, their senior leadership. Folks come in to the grocery store, they shop for their needs, and when they enter, if they identify that they don't have active health care, they go next door to the Baycare Services Center, which is staffed by Baycare clinicians who do a basic assessment and then help them figure out where they may need to go for additional health. Again, you know us, we ought not be in the healthcare business, right? Probably don't want us examining, but we're able to make sure when that individual comes, we can, right? So our thinking has really evolved to much more beyond food to say, how do we become more client-centric and client-focused?
Yeah, this is great, and it makes me think that you know, the food bank is really the Costco of food banks. You know, it's
Yes.
all in one. I think I go to Costco, I get, you know, a vaccination, or I get some pharmaceutical item that I need. So, and the food and everything else. So it's really, and it's really important what you're saying about time and resources, and having a place where, you know, people can go and get everything they need, is especially when their time is so limited.
Well, and I think, you know, so I'm sure your viewers don't care about this. Costco is my favorite place in the world. But part of what we also love about Costco, and I think is another important aspect, and you've helped us with this immensely over time as well, and that is the retail experience of acquisition of food and resources needs to be a much different conversation and opportunity. And so what we've learned also is that the moment that someone comes into our care, their ability to acquire their food or resources in a dignified manner really matters. Right? That the way you and I go to Costco, we feel welcomed and warm. The environment that's built is engaging and bright. And we feel a particular way when we go there. One of the things that we've tried to do in our service profile is to make sure that the guests that come to see us have a similar experience. Because no one comes to us at their best. They're coming to us scared, challenged, probably a little bit embarrassed. And we want to be able to say, hey, you're welcome here. And so if you come to the Publix community market in our that exists inside our food bank today, we try and create a retail environment you or I would be just as comfortable shopping in, familiar with. We try and create that same experience, because I think the other thing we're very aware of, and this is where USF and you have done such a great job in helping us understand not only the responsibility to serve, but the manner in which we have a responsibility to serve.
Yeah, no, it's been a wonderful relationship and partnership. So I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about what's going on in the world, current events and everything. And actually this even goes back to COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of changes that occurred in terms of food supply chains in general, the economy bottoming out, and you know, fast forward, we have the war in Ukraine and Russia, and now what's going on in the Middle East. You know, could you talk a little bit about your perspective on hunger as both a global and national security issue?
Yeah, I had a chance to run into the general that staged the event that you all had, which I shared with him that I thought it was such an important conversation to have. Because if we don't understand the implications abroad, we don't always understand the implications at home. But there's multiple parts to your question that I want to talk about. I think, let me first talk about COVID and what we saw with that. One of the arguments that we would make to folks, or perhaps create understanding about, is that the average family that comes into our care has very little resource in the bank from which to draw. And bank probably is both literal, meaning they don't have much savings, but they also do not possess the other vehicles that many of us have when we have a variety of challenges. Credit opportunities, ways in which to manage difficult financial circumstances that we can work our way through. Taking a loan from a 401k, any of those things, the people that we serve don't have those vehicles in place, which you or I would say, well, okay, I have some peace of mind because I have that. COVID laid that bare. Mm-hmm. COVID really exposed the underlying weakness of most of our community. Early days, we saw 68% of the people that came to see us had never been to a food line before. That's staggering to think. Yes. People did not have the resources necessary. And this isn't the normal population that visited us. This is a significant part of the you and me and our friends population. I should point out to your viewers that virtually 93 or 94% of everybody that visits us is a part of our local economy. They work, they pay taxes, they're renters, they buy gas, they're consumers of services. So the myth we have to break always is that someone that comes to see us is the person that's panhandling on the side of the road. We think they're a worthy human of care too, but as a percentage of our, right? So we would remind viewers that the folks we are seeing are colleagues, friends, and neighbors. And so COVID laid that bare. So we make our way through COVID. And one of the things that I thought was so good about COVID, to use that term, was the willingness of electeds and appointeds to step in with policy that made sense, that provided safety nets, civic and corporate engagement that said we're going to volunteer and or fund, and then nonprofits who stepped forward dramatically in their service profile to overcome that weakness. And so we saw ourselves as a community make our way through that. But that diminished the underlying capacity of the community dramatically. And so when you see us move into a situation where we have an economic downturn, virtually no one that we serve has the resources to navigate that as well. So sitting here today in October of 23, our numbers and what the data tell us is that our community is in worse shape than it ever has been. Let's talk about what that means in practical terms for a viewer to say, well, why is that the case and what does that mean? United Way does a terrific report every other year called the ALICE report, Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed, right? But you remember ALICE report. That report tells us the family of four, average family of four, a survival budget is $91,000 a year. That's survival. And as a viewer listens to this, go through and do your own math. Healthcare, housing, groceries, gas, childcare, all of those things, it adds up pretty quickly. So that number doesn't include vacations to the Bahamas. It doesn't have any of that. That's a survival budget. It's a lot of money and probably more than most expect. But here's the challenge. The average income in the state of Florida for a family of four is $58,000 a year. So foundationally and fundamentally, the folks that we are serving have a gap that is very difficult to close, and for them, very difficult to manage. One of the things I recall that we've done over the years, and in particular, I remember one of the conversations we had about the behaviors that folks will start to engage in order to acquire food, right? So how do folks go about that? And I remember specifically the conversation we had about folks that would acquire food from friends and neighbors in different ways and things we don't think about. But because if you can't afford to go to a grocery store, what are you doing as coping strategies? Right? So we have a fundamental weakness and a gap that's growing in between what people are earning and what people need to live. And I think this is where the falsehood of the narrative that says, well, the unemployment rate is so low. Well, the unemployment rate has many factors to it, but for the purposes of our conversation, that's not the underlying problem, it's wages. And I think that's the part that we have to ultimately reconcile. And so I think importantly, COVID exposed that. I think ongoing, it's a conversation we need to have, and maybe something we'll talk more about in this discussion today. I think geopolitically, we have significant concerns, and we see this act out in our local world in different ways. You and I talked at the panel discussion about how food is used as a weapon. One of the things I would remind viewers, if you go back and you look at the history of why food stamps were created, folks may not know that food stamps were ultimately created because we had a defense weakness. Right? Post-World War I, we saw that there were many people that were unable to, in World War II, unable to serve because they were unhealthy. And food stamps were created as a way of creating a healthier community so that we could protect our interests. So we tend to think of food stamps as being created for people that were shiftless or didn't care. It's created for a very different reason, which is interesting to think that's a national defense issue. Right? But we also see what happens in Ukraine materially changes our acquisition of food in the United States. So costs go up, supply chain gets lumpy and choppy and becomes unpredictable, which again leads to demand and supply issues. And so it's funny to think that these things can come home. And then when you look at what happens in Washington, and we would always say we're an apolitical organization. It's not appropriate for us to be on one side of the aisle or the other. That's not who we are. But we certainly can tell you what the impact of policy will be. Right? And so when you have a House that can't find a pathway forward, and then legislation stalls behind that, we have two grave concerns sitting here today. Will the Farm Bill be fully funded, which ultimately is what funds both supplemental food programs for farmers, but it also funds the resources that come through SNAP, as it's now known, food stamps as it used to be known. When those things have to sit at bay because funding resolutions can't be had, again, that comes home to our community, because if someone relies on those resources and those resources don't exist, then ultimately you're creating greater demand locally on an organization like ours and all the other social services infrastructure. And so policy, both happenstance internationally and policy and happenstance federally and statewide matter. A number that just came out about a month ago, pandemic era programs that were put in place, like the Child Nutrition Credit Program, right? Child Tax Credit Program. We've seen a doubling of childhood poverty since that was sunsetted. And so, again, it sounds like we're criticizing. We're not. We're identifying, right? Because what would you as an educator say to a child that doesn't have access, right? And I think that would be something for you to share here, is what are the ages and what are the outcomes for a child that doesn't have access to nutrition?
No, I mean, it's there are these long-term consequences for being chronically food insecure. It affects mental health, emotional health, physical health, children's growth and development, their ability to perform well in school. It affects the ability of adults to be productive citizens. And it even has a multi-generational effect. We know from research that, if your parents or even your grandparents were chronically hungry, that affects your health and well-being 2 generations later. So that's the other thing, when we talked about this a lot, is the kind of these long-term consequences for both individual and community health, being chronically hungry, chronically food insecure. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think David, again, we continue to file social services in the category of a moral issue or a charitable issue. Part of the conversation we want to have with the community is, you may or may not believe that this is your moral or charitable responsibility. I understand that. We can suspect that everybody feels the same way. But what we would tell folks is, so we'd say to a corporation, the folks who are struggling with food insecurity are one of 3 groups that we think matter to you. They're your colleagues, they're your consumers, or they're your community. My guess is all 3 matter to you. So even if you don't want to have a moral conversation, which is okay, you ought to understand that an insufficiency, food insecurity, economic instability directly impacts your colleagues, your consumers, and your community. And so we think it makes good financial sense. And this is a conversation you and I had 10 years ago at our first lunch, close to 11 years ago now, where we talked about how can we help the community to understand that the decisions that we make both in policy and practice are challenging. And if we go back to the conversation we had a moment ago, if you understand that the folks that we're serving have a basic economic imbalance that's not easily solved, is it smarter to invest in strategies that keep those individuals and families stable because it benefits colleagues, consumers, community? I think that's a conversation that we need to continue to have because I think that's one of the things that we all need to understand. You and I believe in the humanitarian and the moral responsibility we have to those that we serve. But you, again, and the center that we set up here have done such a good job in helping us try and identify, here are the long-term outcomes. And the question we should ask ourselves is, are we okay with those outcomes? You know, if you're a healthcare provider, are you okay with seniors seeing you at a much higher rate because they're food insecure? If you're an educational system, are you okay with the dropout rate being high as a result of kids not having proper nutrition and failing their way through school and ultimately leaving? If you're a corporation or individual, are you okay with your workforce being challenged by life's problems that are brought about by economic issues? I think those are the conversations and questions we need to ask ourselves and have because I think that's the point that's getting lost in the argument about whether someone's pulling their load.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think one thing that Feeding Tampa Bay has done really well at is raising awareness about the kind of diversity of food insecurity. Again,
Yes.
It's not the panhandler. I mean, that certainly is.
They're a human that matters to us,
Right,
but they're not the
but they're not the-
predominant.
right.
Right.
And you know, and making people aware that there are these connections with health and well-being throughout the life course. Maybe you could talk a little bit about raising awareness, because that's really the only thing that's going to move the needle
Yes.
and get our representatives to,
Yes.
you know, to make changes in policy. And we see those changes already.
Yeah, I think so. Probably more than any other issue, we have spent time and resource on trying to figure out ways to change the narrative. So last night we had folks from the large healthcare system in our community, Baycare Inn. And the conversation that we had with them, which is an important point we want to make, is food insecurity is not a moral crisis, it's a healthcare crisis. Now that's a conversation that we want to make sure that people understand the difference between it. Right, so we want to make sure that people understand a couple of things, and I think trying to make the arguments tough. We all tend to, focus on our self-interest and the things that are driving our day-to-day lives. You and I are no different. But the conversation we're trying to have with the community in general is really twofold. First is you need to rethink who is in our care, because you know someone. Everybody that watches this program today knows someone who is seeking our care. You literally know people that come to see us on a regular basis. If you're a part of a corporation, 18% of your people statistically come to a food relief organization. So look around at your pay and your colleagues, and so we want to remove the conversation. We say this frequently, let's take them out of our vocabulary and let's substitute us. And I think if we understand it's us, it hopefully draws us into that relationship and suggests to us that we're taking care of a friend, a colleague, right, or a neighbor, which feels more familial and familiar to us, maybe which we want to participate in. So I think if we could change that narrative. I think the second conversation we're trying to have with the community, and we've talked a little bit about this in the last part of our discussion, is that communities, in our opinion, are best raised from the bottom up. Right, so to the extent that you help the entirety of the community, the bottom naturally lifts the top. And so if we do a better job of coming in and saying, let's make sure there's greater household and individual stability, by its very nature, you create community stability, which again, for all of us, we would agree we want. One of the things that I've been here 11 years, And Tampa will tell you that they are extraordinarily proud of how they've evolved, right? So USF would be extraordinarily proud to say how much progress they have made over that last 12 years. So we all feel a sense of pride about where we live and where we work and the communities that we're in. We ought to be able to appeal to that, to say, hey, let's make sure that everybody that is here has that same opportunity. And I think that's the part that we're trying to move towards, is engaging the community in the broader conversation that says, to the extent that everyone is healthy in the community is healthy.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, we're just have a few minutes left. Maybe you could talk.
How could 30 minutes have gone by so fast?
It just flies by, but it always does when we have these conversations. I really enjoy them a lot, and I learn a lot from you. And maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the exciting things that are happening at the food bank, in the last couple minutes.
So we are investing dramatically in our capacity as an organization, and that's going to manifest itself in two ways. Most notably, we and you as a board member helped lift up a $60 million capital campaign that'll build a brand new facility. And that facility will house the future of food relief, but also community-centered care in the Tampa Bay area. So we're building a place where you can move food, store food, but half of the space that we're building is built around people. So we will have an entire community-centric area that if you're a client coming on campus, you can get a variety of services together, going back to the concept we mentioned a moment ago. But we're also building a facility where all of our partners can come together as well, our community can use. So we have a vision of we could have built a place to move food, we built a place to move people. So the first manifestation of our future is the opening of that facility, which will be early next year. The second manifestation of this is a really bold, broad, and certainly thoughtful strategic plan that will enhance our service profile dramatically. So more food, more resources, more health, but also far more connection and collection of services, and creating that client-centered approach that builds better resources for our clients, but also coalesces our partnerships around the community so that experience of our clients is very different. I would, again remind you, this is a pretty innovative approach to the work that we're doing. There aren't many food banks that built as much space for the community as we have, but our theory of change says if we invest more up front on the prevention side, the long-term outcomes are far better for our community. And in the long run, I think that's our interest, is community well-being. Our North Star is to build a way for our community to be healthy, capable, and ultimately thrive.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you, David.
This is going to wrap up this special episode of the GNSI Speaker Series. I really enjoyed hosting today's episode, and it's really a pleasure and honor to have Thomas Mantz here, the President and CEO of Feeding Tampa Bay, and we look forward to hearing all the wonderful things Thomas and the food bank do in the coming years.
Thank you, David.